Well, thanks for coming to our course. I'm Dr. Tino, and this is going to be ISCI 1030, and this is Science, Society, and Sustainability. This is going to be a team taught course. We're going to break it down into three blocks. I'll be teaching the first block, I'll be teaching the science block, and we'll have labs and stuff, etc. You'll see that in the syllabus. So we put the syllabus there on eLearn. The second half will be either Dr. Cropper or Mr. Martin, and again, they'll finish up the last two parts of the course. So it's a hybrid course. So I'll make these video lectures for one day of class. And again, you can watch them at your leisure as long as you watch them before Monday. So again, we'll meet for class on Monday, and then I'll put these videos out there and make sure you'll have these videos watched before Monday. During class, we'll have a lot of discussion. So I'll put a lot of discussion topics out there, and so we'll spend a lot of time talking about topics. If you ever have any questions, just feel free to email me. The email is on the syllabus, and again, I'll get back to you uh, within a matter of hours, basically. So let me go ahead and shut off this camera. I think let me pause it. So a couple of things. The goal of this course is to really see how science, society are going to interact with each other, interact and talking about humans and the earth. We look at all the ecological system and how we can have a sustainable future. So we'll talk about some of the problems we have, especially now we have all this industrial revolution. A lot of good things came out of it, all these big advances, but we'll talk about how we can try to have a sustainable future so that we can maintain our standard of life. In fact, not even. We want to increase it. We want to increase our standard of living, not just for us, people in the US and Europe and all these developing countries, but for these poorer countries as well. So our goal is to use science, talk about how society interacts. So society has a big fact about this, especially economic factors. And we'll talk about how we're going to interact with the earth. Again, you hear the word ecosystem, so that's everything around earth, how they interact with each other, plants, animals, water, air, you name it. And how we can have a more sustainable future, and a future now in which we'll have a higher standard of living. I think that's the main thing. We want a higher standard of living. We don't want to do without. We want to live better than we're doing now. So let's take a look at some definitions. Normally, I don't like to read a definition verbatim, but this is a good definition of sustainability. So let's take a look at this. It says that sustainability is the ability of Earth's systems to survive and adapt to changing environmental conditions. And so remember, the Earth has been around for billions of years. A lot of things have changed over those years. So we want to take a look how the Earth has survived up to now. We want to look at how this, how weather has changed, geography has changed, water levels have changed. We had glaciers, we had ice ages and stuff. Let's take a look how these ecosystems, again, ecosystems are everything, animals, plants, etc., how they survived and continue to survive. And we need to look at the past to have ideas of how these things are going on. And when I say Earth systems, they're both natural systems and the human systems too. I mean, a big part of sustainability has to be with our society, our cultural norms, political implications also. So we'll take a look at all those in this class. So a couple of things I want to emphasize is that this class is going to look at environmental science. And so this is a science that's been backed up with a lot of data, experiments, etc. It's not environmentalism, so sometimes people get this confused. Environmentalism are people that advocate for the environment. A lot of this is mostly like political, social political movements. A lot of that stuff is based on science, but let's make a big distinction. We're studying environmental science, so this is hard data. This is no different than chemistry and physics, etc. And so this has been backed up by a lot of experiments. So environmental science, it's been backed up. A lot of times you hear the word theories. When you say a theory in science, we'll talk more about that in, I think it's chapter 2. When you hear theories in science, theories are like Big Bang Theory. In science, theories are backed up by a lot of data, experiments, etc. Sometimes we take that word too lightly, but theory in science has been backed up by data, science, etc. So again, just make sure that we're looking at environmental science, not environmentalism per se. And we want to look at things that we can do to maintain sustainability. Again, there's a lot of things you've heard of. Like nowadays, a big thing is plastics, especially now these plastic bags. So we're having a lot of problems with plastic bags. You get them like in every store, they'll give you 1,000 plastic bags. We're trying to recycle these nowadays because these things are bad for the environment. So we'll talk about some of the causes of that and how we can improve on this, etc. So when we talk about environmental science, we're really talking about um, the study of connections in nature and basically how life has thrived up to now. So we want to see how life has survived and thrived. Again, Earth's been around for billions of years. Plants, animals have all interacted. We want to see how they interact, how they survived, and we want to look at ways of dealing with stuff more sustainably. So again, this is going to be the future. And this is actually, I think, is going to lead to a lot of jobs. So this is always, I'm always real positive about that. I think a lot of jobs in the future is going to be some so-called green chemistry or green science, making things more environmentally friendly, reducing waste, recycling, etc. So again, some stuff we have to recycle, like the nutrients in our soil, the nitrogen. There's a finite amount of nitrogen, phosphorus in our soils. Metals, certain only a finite amount of iron, aluminum. You'll have what they call the rare earth metals, which is used for cell phones, etc. There's only a certain amount of that, and we have to recycle those. So we'll talk about how that plays a part also in this environmental science and a big part of our sustainability. Also, I always like the part of reducing. So it's always good to reduce this waste to begin with, and recycle also. They kind of work hand in hand. There's basically three principles of sustainability. First one is that everything depends on solar energy. So all the light that we have, and it's not just visible light. So visible light is the one that we see, but stuff like infrared light, ultraviolet light. So ultraviolet, you hear this, like you're not supposed to stay out in the sun so long because it's an ultraviolet light. Lights that we can't really detect with our normal eyes can damage your skin. So everything depends. Everything comes from the sun. All types of light comes from the sun. Plants use this through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, you may have heard of it. Plants take up carbon dioxide in the air. They use that energy from the sun. So let's put some energy there. And what's going to happen is they'll form, they call it glucose, but basically they'll form food that we need or the plants need, and then they'll give off oxygen gas. And it's a reversible process. It goes back and forth. So plants and animals, etc. Once your food breaks down, you talk about sugars, basically like glucose. Once it breaks down in your body, you're going to go ahead and expel that carbon dioxide. So it's just this recycling of carbon dioxide, basically. Carbon dioxide comes from the atmosphere. Plants convert it to food or to make these plants grow. We eat these plants. As humans, we eat these plants. We'll convert that food. We break it down, reacts with the oxygen. Eventually, we expel that as carbon dioxide gas. So again, it's just kind of a recycling throughout nature. But the big thing is everything depends on solar energy. We need biodiversity. We need a large pool of genes, organisms, species, etc. Because some survive and some don't. So we need a large pool to choose from. I mean, if we start limiting our biodiversity, we can have problems. We may not survive in the future. So again, we need a large pool of organisms to survive because some will survive naturally, some won't. We need a large pool to choose from. And then I've talked a little bit about chemical recycling. This is like we have to recycle the nutrients in our soil. We have to recycle metals. And I mentioned before the rare earth metals. These are used a lot to make batteries for cell phones. And we need that stuff, right? I mean, we need our cell phones, we need our Wi-Fi, etc. So we need to recycle these things throughout nature. And again, I kind of mentioned about this. So this is the solar. This is our recycling, and then this is our biodiversity. Couple of things. Again, this is one of my favorite definitions here is that we have natural capital, and this is all of our resources, all of our food, water, etc., and ecosystem services. So it's a combination of both natural and the ecosystem services. And the ecosystem services, we'll go through that definition in the next slide, is processes in nature that support life. So we'll talk about how these processes can do what they call like pest control, how they can purify water or air naturally. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. So let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at this. So when you have natural capital, we're talking about natural resources plus ecosystem services is a combination of the two. And so the blue is going to be our natural resources, our air, our water, our soil. Those are our natural resources. Land, life. And then the ecosystem services, I mean, this is stuff that can naturally recycle these natural resources. So I mentioned before, population control, pest control. This will maintain our life, uh, our air purification, climate control, UV protection. So this is where we talk about the ozone layer. So we have that ozone layer in nature to protect us from these very bad ultraviolet rays. They still get through, but this protects a good part of that. Well, I think like 20, 30 years ago, the big thing was a hole in the ozone layer, which was basically a thinning of the ozone layer. And again, if these ultraviolet rays come, they can damage our skin a lot. So we have to be careful with that. Again, we talk about the environment. The reason you want to limit greenhouse gases because it's going to increase our temperature, right? And that's never going to be a good thing if it increases too much. So ecosystems are things that kind of replenish our natural resources. Uh, Stuff like fossil fuels, that's a natural resource. That's non-renewable. Though actually, I think over thousands and thousands of years we'll have back some more fossil fuels. But non-renewable is things that don't replenish itself in a timely manner. So something that replenishes itself over 100,000 years, we're going to consider that non-renewable. Renewable sources, stuff like the sun, wind, water. I mean, this is stuff that's always going to be around. We're always going to have sun. We're always going to have wind. We're always going to have water flowing, etc. Those are natural sources. So land is a natural source. Uh, Food production, nutrient recycling. Those are our ecosystem surfaces. This is how we replenish our nutrients in the land, how food is produced from plants, etc. A couple of things also, the social sciences play a big part in sustainability. This is stuff like politics. If you listen to the presidential debates, that's a big thing. They mention about like big oil. Do you and you talk about the implications that if we get off oil, right? I mean, use a lot of jobs, etc. So politics plays a big thing in these social sciences. I think the consensus is we want a long-term transition out of fossil fuels. We can't do that thing overnight. It's going to be impossible. And nobody wants to do that anyway. It'll cost a lot of jobs. We don't have the resources to maintain it. I mean, if we're off oil, where's our electricity going to come from? How are we going to run our cars, etc. So again, Social scientists have a big thing in terms of sustainability. So, but I think we need to have like long-term solutions to these problems. Nothing that we want to change overnight, because we want to maintain our standard of living. Again, I'm always going to emphasize that we want to maintain our standard of living, and we want to maintain our economic powers too. So we don't want to have to spend too much money for fuels, etc. So a big economic impact. Again, those are social sciences that has a big impact on sustainability, especially moving forward. And again, we've kind of mentioned it. We're going to talk about ethics in class. We'll talk about some questions about how much we should be responsible for the future generations, and how much we should be responsible for using up our resources on Earth. Again, I kind of mentioned a little bit about this. We know this is from experience, which resources are renewable and some are not. Uh, Inexhaustible resource. This is stuff like solar, wind. So we have wind power. Those things are going to be around forever. Uh, a renewable source are stuff that we can replenish in a relatively short period of time. If we cut down forests, well, the forests are going to grow back eventually. We use up the nutrients in the soil. Well, we can replenish that. We can add nutrients. We can add fertilizers. So those are renewable sources. Sustainable yield. This is kind of a good definition. Is the highest rate in which we can use these renewable sources without reducing available supply. So there's a limit of how fast we can use up these resources, like how fast we can cut down the forest and have others growing to take its place. I mean, there's a limit on how we can do it. I mean, if we cut down our forest too quickly, forest's not going to grow back in time, increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we can have all kinds of problems. Um, Same thing with minerals. We can only use so much minerals and still have enough now for our future generations. Only so many nutrients we can use in agriculture, right? Before that soil won't replenish itself. So that's the rate. That's sustainable yield. It's the rate. It's how fast we can use a renewable source without now reducing the available supply. So we got to be careful. The main thing is you want to use it as a slower rate as you can. You don't want to use up everything all at once. You have nothing left. You just want to kind of be able to say, okay, I use a little bit over time, so it's going to be around like in the future. We've talked about non-renewable sources. Fossil fuels is a big one. So again, even if we use up all of our oil, you know, oil, again, when I say fossils, this is by plants and animals dying. It's going to replenish itself eventually, but it may be 50,000 years down the road, 100,000 years. That's why it's a non-renewable source. It's nothing that it's going to replenish itself in a timely manner. I mentioned metals, especially now metals that we use like iron, aluminum, metals that we use like lithium for batteries, etc. And then some of these mineral resources that also we may not be able to get. So some minerals are so dilute. So dilute means they're hard to get to. They're kind of spread out over large areas, and they're hard to get to. Big thing now is like gold. Now gold nowadays, if you're mining for gold, I mean, you get gold dust really. You don't really get good chunks of gold anymore, at least not very often, because that gold has been diluted now. Most of that easy gold has already been taken out of the ground. And so you have these mining companies that will just use up vast amounts of land just to get a little bit of gold dust and then extract that. So these are sources that are not going to be renewable. We're not going to have any more gold in the foreseeable future. I think also a couple of things is that it's not only that when I say non-renewable, we're not going to replenish it. One also problem with sustainability is that some of this natural capital will degrade. It will degrade, so it's not very useful anymore. Again, shrinking forests, right? We may not be able to cut down all of our forests, but they'll shrink down low enough that they can cause some problems for our society. Um, Wildlife habitats. If you reduce these wildlife habitats, you'll have less biodiversity. So those can be serious problems. Also, climate change, right? We don't have enough forests, you don't have enough plants, you pollute our waters too much. They may not naturally be able to purify it. So we have to be careful with things like that. We have natural capital degradation. Uh, you can reduce some of our or degrade some of our renewable natural resource. Again, this is why we need to. This is why you have to study the sustainability with this. Uh, Again, mention a few of these: shrinking forests, decrease wildlife habitats, species extinction, climate change, air pollution, soil erosion. And this is stuff that we can renew, right? I mean, we can fix air pollution. We probably can adjust climate change. I think there's ways of doing that. Fix soil erosion. But if we use these too quickly, we won't be able to do it. We'll degrade it so much to the point that the soil is too weak. It's too poor to grow agriculture, to grow food, etc. One thing also, our ecological footprint. So again, this is kind of like a few years ago when you were buying a car, they would talk about carbon footprint. A carbon footprint from a car was basically now like how much carbon dioxide gas your car will produce per year. It depends on the gas mileage. The better the gas mileage, again, carbon dioxide gas is an emissions from your car. Uh, the better the gas mileage, the lower the carbon footprint with that. So ecological footprint includes everything. Is everything, all of our natural resources that we need to maintain our standard of living. Uh, One thing is they measure it in terms of area to support a single person. Hectare is basically 2.5 acres, 43,560 feet, square feet. Doesn't mean too much in terms of feet, but in terms of acres and hectares. So a hectare is basically 2.5 acres. And it tells you like, this is how much land, this is how much area we need to maintain our standard of living. Again, this includes everything, all of our resources together. So say I'm Dr. Tino, all the resources I need to maintain my standard of living uh, measures in terms of acres. So how I can maintain my cell phone, run my car, get my clothes, etc. So a few things, and again, this is why sustainability becomes important. Right now, they estimate that every human living today, we're using about the equivalent of 1.7 Earths to provide all the resource that we need. Now, for the time being, we can still maintain that, right? Because we got a lot of stuff. But over time, right, if we start having this unsustainability, it's kind of like if you go to the bank and you have your savings in the bank, it's kind of like using up all your savings. So say you have like $100,000 and you start dipping into that. Well, at first it's not going to be a problem, but eventually you're going to run out of money. What we want to do really is like live off the interest. That's our main thing. We want to live off the interest of that $100,000. So that $100,000 will always be there. We're just living off that interest. That's the main thing. So right now we're not really doing that. We're dipping down a little bit too deep. So we want to reduce this. We can't maintain this 1.7 Earths forever. As you expect, this is a good graph. Ecological footprints, human developments. Right here is the developed countries. So this is like USA. So the more developed countries, they have a larger, of course, ecological uh, footprint. Poorer countries have a lower one because they have less resources. I used to teach in Kenya. So I was in the U.S. Peace Corps. And then I used to teach university there for several years. And they have limited resources. One good thing is they're developing at a very quick pace. So like Africa's Asia, you talk about China, India, these countries are developing. I've noticed it just from Kenya, and I was there 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more now, 20 years ago. They've really improved. I mean, back then it was hard for them to have a phone, TV, transportation. Nowadays they have cell phones, they all have TVs, they have electricity for the most part, they have vehicles. So everybody's standard of living is improving, which means that their ecological footprints are also increasing. Uh, some of these places here, this will be like stuff like I think like Saudi Arabia and some of these Middle East countries. They use up a lot of oil for their resources. But again, I think right in here would be like China and India. So they're developing at a very quick pace. Again, this is what we want. We want society to develop, and so our ecological footprints are increasing. Again, this is like what we need to maintain. This is the line. And again, these developed countries like Europe and stuff, we're way above it. So there's got to be a way for us to maintain our standard of living, reduce our ecological footprint. And again, as you expect, one thing is the reason we're much bigger, 'cause in Europe is just as developed as the U.S. Same thing like Japan, they're just as developed. Is that the U.S. is much more spread out. Uh, you'll see this now, like for the lockdown, stuff like Europe and Japan, it was easier for them to lock down because their city centers are much more congested, and people live in apartment buildings and stuff like that. They don't have the space that we do, so there's not as many streets, and you can walk every place for the most part. U.S. you can, you have a vehicle. So again, this is why our ecological footprint is more in terms of hectares. It's because we're just more spread out. It's not that because our standard of living is much higher. Yeah, I think it is a little bit higher to be honest. We have more stuff. Is that we don't share as much as they do in those countries because we just have the space to live basically any place that we want. China, India, they're increasing. So again, these are again most of the population lives in China, India. All of these have over a billion people. So maybe a third of the world lives in China or India. Their ecological footprints are increasing as their standard of living increases, etc. Again, people heard about China. China's improving. Again, this is most of the world is improving. To be honest with you, they're all having larger ecological footprints, and that's a good thing, by the way. It's not a good thing that we have a large ecological footprint. It's a good thing that our standard of living is improving, uh, etc. So it's a good thing that people's standard of living is improving. But again, what that means is that our ecological footprint is improving, is larger, and we have to be able to kind of slow that down, but maintain our standard of living. Again, I'm always going to emphasize that. Let's maintain our standard of living, but reduce our ecological footprint. So a few things uh, that we can look at to grow or shrink our ecological footprints. Uh, we can look at why our footprint has grown so much anyway. A lot of it is our agricultural revolution. Nowadays, things are much easier to grow. Back in the say Middle Ages or before the Industrial Revolution, people would just work the land. They call it sustainable farming. Just use maybe a few acres of land to sustain them. Nowadays, though, we have this agricultural revolution. We have more fertilizers, animal farming, etc. These are big changes that has actually grown our ecological footprint, but it can also shrink it too. So again, these can work hand in hand. Can find new farming methods to become more efficient. So use less land to grow more. Reduce pesticides, etc. So again, we're working on this. This is going to be a way for us to hopefully to reduce our ecological footprints, but still have as much food as we have now. Medicine, same thing. Information. Uh, I think a lot of it is information. The fact is that some people may not believe in climate change or uh, global warming and stuff like that. But we need to educate people and talk about what we think is happening. I think that's the main thing. You can't force people to believe, but you can give them data and talk about how that we're going to have to try to do certain things in order to sustain our society. I think for the most part, and I always kind of talk about this, I think it's going to come from an economic standpoint. And again, we'll talk about that. What do you think is going to be the moving factor towards a sustainable society? Economic standpoint is usually something that really hits hard. If all of a sudden gas is $10 a gallon, well, people are going to start using less. So I think we saw that a few years ago when gas was high, maybe $3, $4 a gallon, $5 a gallon. People did reduce. So, and you saw this. Unfortunately, you saw this during this lockdown here. People weren't traveling as much. They stayed at home. Our ecological footprint actually went down overall. Let's take a look at our what experts have said are our five basic environmental problems. First one is going to be population growth. And again, one thing, we'll talk about population growth. These poorer countries usually have a higher birth rate. I think I saw that when I was in Kenya. And the reason is that, first of all, the death rates for children are much higher. So, though that's improving too. So they have less medical care and stuff like that. People's lifespans are shorter than they are in developing countries. So they have more babies, etc. For the population growth, a lot of times also is that they don't have like good social systems in these poorer countries, and so they'll have as many kids as they can. Hopefully, that one or two kids can provide for them in their old age. So again, that's a big like social and cultural norms in those countries. So we have population growth, though that population growth is going to level off, I think, eventually. Unsustainable resource use, using up all of our minerals, nutrients, all of our forests, cutting down wildlife habitations. That's unsustainable. That's a big problem. Poverty, I think I've talked about it. In these poorer countries, I say these developing countries, they're just want to live day to day. They're not thinking that if I cut down these forests to make fuel, again, you can cut down trees, or you can burn these trees under dirt. I used to see that to make coal. We'll talk about that in class. That's a lot of deforestation, but they don't care about that. They need fuel. I mean, they don't have money to buy fuel or to get reliable electricity. They don't have those type of resources. And so poverty for these people, they want to survive day to day. They don't think at the long term future. They don't care that if you use plastic bags or whatever the case may be. They're more worried just about living day to day. So again, saying that we want to live in a more sustainable future doesn't really affect those people too much. They have other more important priorities than that. One thing is, this is also something people have talked about nowadays, excluding environmental costs from market prices. Whenever we get our goods, we don't think about the detriment effects that maybe how we produce some of these foods, or maybe some of this animal farming, or some of these minerals that we get. We don't talk about how that affect the environment, or maybe overfishing. We don't talk about that too. We just want something as cheap as we can, and so companies will exclude the true market prices with that. Again, that's an economic problem. And then we'll talk about increase in isolation from nature. So most people nowadays live in the cities. We don't see some of these effects that pollution and stuff, deforestation will have, or will have on nature. So we don't see that, or cutting down all these wildlife habitats. We don't see that because we live so far away from nature. We may go out hiking every once in a while, but we live very far removed from nature. And again, we talked about this. We'll watch a little video in class about population growth. And again, it's really spurt up gets around the Industrial Revolution. So this is a big time in which you have the Industrial Revolution, better medicine, lifespan has increased, and so you have this large population growth. Most of it is spurred by these developing countries. So some of these poorer countries will have a much higher uh, birth rate. But again, you need a certain birth rate to maintain society also. I think the U.S. is good. I think our birth rate in the U.S. is pretty good. It's sustainable. We have enough people being born that's going to sustain our older generation, etc. Something like Europe, their birth rate has decreased a little bit too much. They're having problems too. So again, there's not it's not just like the fact that we don't want any births. We need a certain number of births per people to maintain society as it is. But again, eventually these poorer countries, they're developing, right? And so the more developed a country is, the wealthier a country is, the lower these birth rates are going to be. This big dip, I think they had to do with the Black Plague and stuff. So the Black Plague killed like maybe a third of the people on Earth or Eastern Europe, and that led a little bit of a population decrease. But again, it's going to level off. Watch a little video about that. A few things. We'll talk about harmful and beneficial environmental effects of wealth. So wealth, you use more resources. So that's kind of, you have a larger ecological footprint, but also with wealth, you can spend money uh, to reduce population, reduce pollution, reduce waste, fund new technology. So wealth has benefits also. It's not like, okay, these wealthy nations are using up all of our resources. They also have the funds now to reduce pollution. I should say reduce pollution. Invent money or put money into renewable technologies, etc. And again, that's because there's better education, uh, which is going to lead, I think, to more investments into these renewable sources. So wealth, it's a trade-off. They use more resources, but I think with more investment into these types of renewable sources and stuff, they can reduce waste, reduce environmental degradation, etc. Because and mainly because it's through education. They have more time, they have more education with this. Yeah, we talked about poverty. Um, they're more interested in these poorer countries just for their survival needs. They're not worried on maybe all this coal mining they're doing, all this deforestation. They don't care about the long-term environmental effects. And why would they? They got to survive uh, day to day. Um, again, we talked about that. More children. I think a lot of it now is for their long-term care because they don't have good, like they don't have Social Security in some of these poorer countries. So you need their children to take care of them. Otherwise, who's going to take care of them what they get when they get older? And again, they've had their whole store of problems. Malnutrition is a problem. Um, some poor sanitation facilities, and then respiratory disease. All these things are improving, by the way. So things are improving in these countries this as we speak. We talked a little bit about this. We'll spend some time talking in class about the environmental cost of resource use. We don't include the harmful environmental cost. This is actually going to be a problem, I think, because I'm like everybody else uh, who wants to pay more. Nobody really wants to pay more. We'll talk about that in class. We want things as cheap as you can get for the most part. I mean, some people don't mind paying extra if they think they're improving the environment, and those are good people. Uh, Companies receive subsidies, so a lot of times some of these companies subsidies are when government gives these companies money, maybe to grow certain foods, like the dairy industry is always big subsidized with this, and so subsidies are what governments will give companies to grow maybe food cheaply, grow resources more cheaply, etc., which means people use more, right? So they may have bigger detrimental effects on the environment, but people use more because it's just cheaper. And again, we've talked about being increasingly isolated from nature. I mean, I've always lived in the cities my whole life. Now, when I was in Africa, in Kenya for a while, I did live out in the rural areas. Um, it was a little bit hard to get water back then. I didn't have electricity, so you would use like kerosene lamps and stuff like that. You go pump your water uh, with that. But what they're talking about this is that people don't really think about where your food, water, energy, etc., come from. If you don't see where it's coming from, if you don't see maybe some of the detrimental effects that some of these processes that we use have, you're not going to care. I think that they're saying is if you go out and you see it, if you do see water pollution, in which people are drinking polluted water, it's going to make you think about, well, how are ways to improve it, etc. So the isolation from nature. And again, we kind of talked about it. To be environmentally sustainable, we want to protect our natural capital and live off its income. So again, this is like living off your interest. You have $100,000, you want to live off its interest. You don't want to use up that $100,000. You want it to be there as long as it can. So thanks for listening. One quick thing is that for our Zoom discussion on class, we'll have a lot of discussions. Go ahead. It's a little bit of homework, but it's not hard. Go ahead. I want you to think of some specific examples of natural resources, of ecosystem services, and some causes of environmental problems. Again, we'll meet in class next week. So for this semester, we meet on Mondays, and we'll discuss this. We'll have a lot of Zoom discussions with that. So everybody go ahead and stay safe, and thanks for listening.